This is the place where forgotten stories are resurrected and the past rediscovers its voice. Before we start, please let us know in the comments where you are joining us from. Your city, your country, and the time you are watching. It is always incredible to see how far these narratives travel across the world. If you enjoy powerful history stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like so more people can discover these hidden moments from the past. Tonight's story centers on a man the world tried to erase, a man so immense and imposing that people whispered about him as if he were something beyond human. His name was Count. The men who held him in bondage called him a monster. The enslaved people who labored at his side called him a protector, and the town that sought his destruction would later remember him as something far more sinister. They claimed he stood 8.5 feet tall, taller than any man they had ever seen. His shoulders resembled the trunk of a great tree, his hands like wooden shovels. The plantation owners feared him long before he ever raised a hand against them. They feared him because he refused to bow his head. They feared him because he spoke little but observed everything. And most of all, they feared him because deep down, they knew something terrible would happen the day they pushed him too far. What followed would transform a quiet southern town into a place people refused to travel through after nightfall. This is the story of the day they attempted to hang the giant slave named Count. And the instant the rope gave way, something far darker rose in its place. Count arrived on the plantation during the summer of 1856. No one in the county had ever beheld a man like him before. The wagon carrying him rolled slowly down the dusty road, and even the horses pulling it seemed unsettled. Two traders sat in front, murmuring to one another while repeatedly glancing back at the enormous figure chained behind them. Count sat upright with iron around his wrists and ankles. But he did not resist. He appeared calm, almost patient, as if he understood something the others did not. The moment the wagon entered the plantation yard, every worker stopped what they were doing. Cotton sacks dropped from weary shoulders. Hoes froze mid-stroke in the soil. Even the overseer forgot to shout for a moment. The giant stepped down from the wagon, and the wooden boards groaned loudly under his weight. One of the traders cleared his throat and forced a laugh, attempting to make the moment seem ordinary. He said this man was strong enough to pull a plow on his own. He said the plantation owner had just acquired the most valuable worker in the entire state. But the laughter did not spread. Instead, the yard fell quiet. Count stood there slowly, taking in each face around him. His eyes were deep and calm, but they held something powerful behind them. An old enslaved man later said that when Count looked at you, it felt as though he could see every lie you had ever told. The plantation owner stepped forward. A thin man named Caleb Turner, known for his cruel temper and love of control. Turner walked around Count slowly, examining him the way a butcher sizes up a large animal before slaughter. He touched the giant's arm, then his shoulder, and then looked up with a smile that was both proud and uneasy. Turner believed power came from breaking strong men, and standing before him now was the strongest man he had ever encountered. The first weeks passed in an unusual silence. Count worked harder than anyone in the fields, but he rarely spoke. From sunrise until nightfall, he lifted cotton sacks that two men normally carried together. He chopped wood faster than the others could stack it. When the overseer ordered him to pull a wagon stuck in deep mud, Count wrapped a thick rope around his chest and dragged the entire wagon forward while the horses stood uselessly beside him. The workers watched him with quiet amazement, but also with concern. Strength like that always attracted trouble. The overseers began to test him. shouting orders louder than usual, pushing him, trying to provoke anger. But Count did not react. He simply continued working with the same steady rhythm, like a giant machine made of muscle and patience. At night, the enslaved workers gathered quietly near the cabins, whispering about the newcomer. Some believed he had once been a warrior in his homeland before being captured. Others believed he carried a spirit inside him that protected him. A woman named Ruth said she saw him one night standing alone under the moon with his eyes closed and his hands raised to the sky, as if he were speaking to something far away. Yet the most curious thing about him was how the children followed him. They were not afraid of his size. In fact, they ran to him whenever they could. He carved small animals from wood and gave them as gifts. He lifted the younger ones onto his shoulders so they could see above the cotton fields. Sometimes he even smiled, a rare, slow smile that softened his enormous face. Those moments worried the overseers even more. A strong man who could inspire hope was far more dangerous than one who simply obeyed orders. Caleb Turner began watching Count closely after a small but troubling incident in the fields. One afternoon, an overseer named Briggs whipped a young boy for dropping a cotton sack. The boy cried out loudly and fell to the ground. The workers kept their heads down the way they always did when punishment came. But Count did something different. He stopped working. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at Briggs. The overseer raised the whip again, but then hesitated. The giant was standing only a few steps away, watching with an expression that was not anger, but something colder, something that felt like judgment. Briggs shouted for Count to get back to work. Count did not move for several seconds. The silence in the field felt heavy and sharp. Finally, the giant bent down, lifted the injured boy gently, and placed him beside a cotton wagon where he could rest. Then he returned to his row and continued picking cotton, as if nothing had happened. But the message was clear. For the first time, someone had interfered with an overseer's punishment. That evening, Briggs stormed into Turner's house, furious and humiliated. He said the giant slave was dangerous. He said if they did not break him soon, the others would begin to believe he was untouchable. Turner listened carefully while sipping whiskey beside the fireplace. At first, he dismissed the complaint, believing that fear alone would control the giant. But that night, he looked out the window toward the distant cabins and saw a tall shadow standing under the moonlight. Even from far away, he knew it was Count. The figure stood perfectly still, like a dark statue watching the plantation. For the first time, Caleb Turner felt a small chill crawl along his spine. He told himself it was nothing, just a large man, just another slave. Yet deep inside he sensed something else growing on his land. Something patient, something powerful, something that would not remain silent forever. And before the year ended, the entire county would witness the moment when that silence finally shattered. The weeks that followed began to change the mood of the entire plantation. Though at first no one could clearly explain why, work continued as usual. The sun rose each morning over the endless rows of cotton, and the overseers shouted their orders the same way they always had. Yet beneath the routine, something invisible had shifted. It started with small moments that seemed harmless at first. When the overseer Briggs raised his whip, the workers no longer looked only at the ground. Sometimes their eyes moved toward Count. They did not speak to him. They did not call his name, but they watched him the way travelers watch a distant storm on the horizon. Count himself did nothing unusual. He continued his work in silence, lifting heavy sacks, cutting wood, repairing fences, and carrying water barrels that normally required 2 men. But his calm presence began to change the air around him. Children ran beside him whenever he walked through the yard. Older workers slowly gathered near him during the short evening breaks. No one dared speak of rebellion. That word could bring death faster than lightning. Yet something stronger than words had begun to grow. It was a feeling, a quiet belief that perhaps fear did not have to rule every moment of their lives. And every time Count stood tall in the fields, that belief grew a little stronger. One evening, an old man named Josiah sat beside the small cooking fire outside the cabins and studied Count carefully. Josiah had lived through more years of slavery than most of the others. His hair had turned white long ago, and his back curved like a bent tree branch. He had seen many strong men arrive on plantations before, men who thought their strength alone could change their fate. None of them lasted long. The system always crushed them sooner or later. Yet, there was something different about the giant sitting across the fire. Count listened more than he spoke. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, observing every word and every expression. Finally, Josiah spoke in a quiet voice that carried both wisdom and warning. He told Count that the plantation owner feared him. Fear was a dangerous seed, he said, because men like Caleb Turner watered that seed with violence. Josiah explained that the overseers were already discussing ways to break the giant's spirit. Some suggested public whipping. Others suggested separating him from the other workers to keep his influence small. Count listened without interruption. When the old man finished speaking, the giant simply nodded once. Then he said something that made everyone near the fire grow silent. Count said that a man could be chained in body, but not in spirit, unless he allowed it. The words were simple, yet the quiet strength behind them carried deep meaning. Josiah studied him for a long moment before slowly shaking his head. He said strength like that would one day bring trouble. Not just for Count, but for everyone near him. The fire crackled softly as the others stared into the flames, wondering which future would arrive first, hope or disaster. Meanwhile, inside the large plantation house, Caleb Turner had begun holding private meetings with his overseers. Briggs was the loudest voice in those meetings. He insisted the giant was poisoning the minds of the workers without even speaking. He said the enslaved people walked differently now. They whispered less in fear and more in curiosity. Turner listened carefully, tapping his fingers against the wooden table while staring into his glass of whiskey. At first, he had been proud to own such a powerful man. The idea of having the strongest worker in the county had filled him with bragging rights among other plantation owners. But pride was slowly being replaced by suspicion. Turner asked if anyone had seen Count disobey a direct order. None had. Had he refused work? No. Had he attacked anyone? Again, the answer was no. The problem was not something the giant had done. The problem was what people believed he might do. Turner knew how fragile control could be. A plantation depended on fear remaining stronger than hope. If that balance shifted even slightly, chaos could grow quickly. After a long silence, Turner finally gave an order. The overseers were to increase discipline across the plantation. Anyone caught gathering in groups at night would be punished. Work hours would be extended. And most importantly, Count was to be watched every moment of every day. Briggs smiled when he heard those instructions. He believed the giant would eventually reveal his true nature under pressure. And when that happened, Briggs promised he would be ready. The first real confrontation came during the harvest season when the fields were at their busiest. One afternoon, a young woman named Elisa collapsed from exhaustion while carrying a heavy cotton sack. The sun burned mercilessly overhead, and the air felt thick and heavy. Briggs rode his horse down the row, shouting insults and accusations. He claimed she was pretending to be weak to avoid work. When Elisa failed to stand quickly enough, he swung his whip across her back. The sound cracked through the field like a gunshot. Most of the workers froze in place. Their eyes locked on the ground as they waited for the punishment to continue. But before Briggs could raise the whip again, something unexpected happened. The shadow of a massive figure moved across the dirt. Count stepped forward and stood between the overseer and the fallen woman. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He simply stood there like a wall of living stone. Briggs stared down at him from the saddle, shocked by the boldness of the act. The field became so quiet that even the distant birds seemed to stop singing. Briggs ordered the giant to move aside. Count did not move for several seconds. The two men stared at each other, one sitting high on a horse with a whip, the other standing on the ground with nothing but calm defiance. Finally, Briggs laughed nervously and lowered the whip. He told the other workers to pick up Elisa and return to their rows. The moment ended without violence, yet the message spread across the plantation faster than fire through dry grass. Someone had finally stood between an overseer and his whip. That night, the cabins buzzed with whispered excitement and fear. Many believed punishment would come quickly and brutally. Yet, hours passed and nothing happened. The overseers remained strangely quiet. Some of them feared confronting a man as large as Count without preparation. Others believed Turner himself wanted to decide how to handle the situation. As the moon climbed higher above the cabins, small groups gathered again despite the new rules against it. They spoke about courage, about dignity, about the strange feeling of seeing an overseer hesitate for the first time. Count himself sat apart from the crowd, staring into the dark forest beyond the fields. Josiah slowly approached and lowered himself onto a wooden crate beside him. The old man spoke softly, reminding the giant that the plantation owner would never forget what happened in the field that day. Count nodded slowly. He understood the danger. But then he said something that would stay in Josiah's memory forever. Count said that fear ruled the plantation only because everyone believed it was stronger than them. The moment people began to question that belief, the entire system would begin to crack. Josiah looked toward the distant plantation house, glowing faintly with lantern light. He whispered that men like Turner would rather burn the world down than allow such cracks to spread. Count said nothing more after that. But as the wind moved softly through the trees, the old man felt a deep uneasiness settle into his chest, because sometimes the smallest spark can ignite the largest fire. Inside the plantation house, Caleb Turner was indeed watching carefully. A messenger had already carried news of the incident to him before sunset. Turner sat in his study with Briggs and two other overseers, listening as the story was repeated again and again. Each version made the moment sound more dangerous. The giant had not attacked anyone, yet his simple act of standing in the overseer's path had shaken the invisible wall of fear that held the plantation together. Turner finally stood from his chair and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, he could see the faint glow of fires near the cabins. He imagined the whispers spreading among the workers. He imagined the dangerous idea forming in their minds that someone might protect them. That thought angered him more than open rebellion ever could. Turner believed order came from absolute dominance. The moment an enslaved person believed he could resist authority, even quietly, the entire structure began to weaken. After a long silence, Turner turned back to his overseers with cold determination in his eyes. He said the giant must be broken publicly, not quietly, not secretly. The entire plantation needed to witness what happened to any man who challenged authority. Briggs nodded eagerly, already imagining the punishment. Yet Turner had something even more dramatic in mind. He wanted an example so powerful that the story would spread far beyond his land, an example that would remind every enslaved worker in the county exactly who controlled life and death. Days later, a rumor began circulating across nearby towns. People heard whispers about the enormous slave owned by Caleb Turner. They heard stories about his impossible strength and his growing influence among the workers. Some laughed and dismissed the rumors as exaggeration. Others grew curious. By the time autumn arrived, Turner had made a decision that would bring crowds from miles away. He announced that a public execution would take place on his property. The charge would be rebellion against authority. The punishment would be hanging from the largest oak tree near the Plantation road. Word spread quickly through farms, taverns, and markets. People were fascinated by the idea of seeing the giant slave who had dared to defy an overseer. Some came seeking entertainment. Others came simply to witness the fall of a man whose legend had already begun to grow. On the plantation itself, the workers felt a wave of dread sweep through the cabins. Soldiers arrived to guard the area. A thick rope was prepared and thrown over a high branch of the old oak tree. The stage for death was quietly assembled, while the giant himself continued working in the fields under heavy watch. Yet those who looked closely at Count noticed something strange. He did not appear afraid. He moved with the same steady strength as always. His eyes remained calm and watchful. It was almost as if he already knew something the others did not. And as the day of the execution approached, the entire county began moving toward Turner's plantation. Wagons rolled down dusty roads carrying curious families. Men gathered near the great oak tree in the morning, whispering and pointing toward the empty rope swinging gently in the wind. None of them realized they were about to witness a moment that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Because, when the rope finally tightened around the neck of the giant called Count, something would happen that no one present could ever explain. And the quiet plantation would soon become a place people feared to speak about after dark. Morning arrived slowly on the day chosen for the execution, and the air over Caleb Turner's plantation felt heavy long before the sun rose above the trees. A thin mist hung across the cotton fields, drifting quietly between the rows like a silent witness, waiting for the day to unfold. The enslaved workers were forced out of their cabins earlier than usual, not to work, but to stand together near the large oak tree by the main road. Soldiers with rifles lined the open yard while overseers moved back and forth, giving sharp orders. The rope hung ready from a high branch of the ancient tree. Its rough fibers dangled down like a promise of death. People from nearby farms and towns continued arriving in wagons and on horseback, gathering in loose circles around the clearing. Some carried food baskets, as if attending a festival, while others stood quietly with uncertain expressions. Public hangings had always drawn crowds in those days, but this one felt different. Everyone had heard the rumors about the giant's size. They spoke his name in low voices. Count. The man who stood 8.5 feet tall. The man who could drag a wagon alone. The man who had dared to stand between a whip and a fallen woman. Curiosity filled the crowd. But so did something else that few wanted to admit. A quiet nervousness. The kind people feel when they are about to witness something they do not fully understand. Among the enslaved workers, the mood was far darker. They stood close together under the watchful eyes of armed guards, their faces filled with dread and sorrow. Many had spent the night whispering prayers or crying quietly inside their cabins. The children clung to their mothers, confused by the tense silence that had replaced the usual morning sounds of work. Josiah stood near the front of the group, with his tired shoulders slightly bent forward. His old eyes moved slowly across the soldiers, the gawking crowd, the rope hanging from the tree. He had lived long enough to witness many cruel punishments, carried out in the name of control. But something about this day unsettled him deeply. It was not just the execution itself. It was the way the plantation owner had turned it into a public spectacle. Turner wanted fear to travel far beyond his land, spreading into other plantations like a warning carried by the wind. Yet Josiah sensed that fear was not the only thing waiting in that clearing. When he looked toward the distant barn, he saw several guards standing beside a large wooden wagon. Chains hung from its sides. Even from far away, he knew who sat inside. Count had been locked there since the night before. The giant had not resisted when the soldiers came for him. Witnesses said he simply stood from his seat near the cabin door and allowed them to bind his wrists. The calmness of that moment had unsettled the guards more than any struggle could have. As the sun slowly climbed higher, Caleb Turner finally appeared from the large plantation house. Dressed in a dark coat and polished boots, his face showed no emotion as he walked toward the oak tree, surrounded by several armed men. Turner had spent the entire night preparing his speech, a declaration meant to remind everyone present that power belonged only to men like him. The crowd quieted as he stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. His voice carried clearly across the clearing as he explained that order must always be protected. He described Count as a dangerous influence, a man whose strength threatened the stability of the plantation. Turner spoke of a rebellion and discipline, of laws that demanded obedience. Some members of the crowd nodded in agreement, while others simply watched with uneasy curiosity. After several minutes, Turner signaled to the guards near the barn. The moment everyone had been waiting for was about to begin. The wagon wheels creaked loudly as it rolled slowly across the dusty yard toward the oak tree. The chains hanging from its sides rattled with each movement. A hush fell over the entire crowd. Even the birds seemed to disappear from the sky as people leaned forward to catch their first clear look at the giant. When the wagon finally stopped beneath the tree, two soldiers climbed onto the back and pulled open the wooden gate. For a moment, nothing moved inside the shadowy interior. Then the giant stood. Gasps spread through the crowd as Count stepped forward into the sunlight. Even those who had heard stories about his size were unprepared for the reality. His head rose far above the shoulders of the soldiers beside him. His arms were thick as tree branches. His chest was broad enough to make the chains across it look small and fragile. Yet, it was not just his size that captured the crowd's attention. It was the calm expression on his face. He did not look angry. He did not look frightened. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the gathered people as if studying them one by one. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably under that steady gaze. The soldiers guided him carefully down from the wagon and toward the rope hanging from the oak branch. The ground seemed to tremble slightly with each heavy step he took. The enslaved workers watched with tears in their eyes. Many of them silently prayed, while others struggled to keep their emotions hidden from the guards. Josiah felt his heart beating harder than it had in years. Something about Count's calmness felt strange, almost unsettling. It was the expression of a man who had already made peace with whatever waited ahead. The execution platform was nothing more than a simple wooden crate placed beneath the rope. A thick knot waited at the end of the noose. The soldiers pushed Count onto the crate and pulled the rope down toward his neck. One of the guards had to climb onto the crate beside him to reach high enough to place the loop properly. The crowd leaned closer, whispering among themselves as they watched the enormous figure standing quietly under the oak tree. Caleb Turner stepped forward once more, determined to finish the event with authority. He announced that the punishment for rebellion would always be death. His voice carried across the silent clearing while the soldiers tightened the rope around Count's neck. When Turner finished speaking, he gave a sharp nod to the guard holding the crate. That simple gesture signaled the final moment. The guard kicked the wooden box away. For a brief second, the rope snapped taut as Count's massive body dropped. The crowd expected the usual quick jerk of a hanging execution. Instead, something strange happened. The rope stretched violently under the enormous weight, the thick fibers groaning as they fought against the strain. A loud cracking sound burst through the clearing. The branch above shook wildly. Before anyone could react, the rope snapped apart with a sharp explosive sound. Count's body crashed heavily onto the ground beneath the tree. Dust flew into the air as the broken rope whipped across the dirt. For several seconds, no one moved. The crowd stared in stunned silence. A few people gasped while others stepped backward in shock. Broken ropes sometimes happened during hangings, but never with a man this large, and never in front of such a crowd. Soldiers rushed forward quickly, pointing rifles at the fallen giant, while the overseers shouted orders. Caleb Turner's face turned pale with anger and embarrassment. The failed execution felt like a public insult to his authority. He barked for the guards to pull the giant back onto his feet and prepare another rope immediately. But the moment the soldiers approached Count, the giant began to move. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the dirt. The chains around his wrists clinked softly as he rose to his full terrifying height once again. A ripple of fear spread through the crowd. Many had expected him to lie motionless after the fall. Yet he stood there breathing calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. One of the guards tried to grab his arm, but Count turned his head and looked directly at him. The soldier froze under that deep, steady gaze. The clearing grew silent again, filled only with the sound of wind moving through the leaves of the oak tree. Caleb Turner shouted angrily for the soldiers to finish the job. Yet something in the air had changed. The broken rope lay twisted on the ground like a warning. Some members of the crowd began whispering nervously to each other. Superstitious fear moved quickly through their minds. A few even stepped away from the tree, as if expecting something terrible to happen next. Count slowly lifted his chained hands and looked at the broken rope beside his feet. For the first time since the morning began, he spoke. His voice was deep and calm, carrying easily across the clearing. He said only a few simple words. Yet those words would remain in the memories of everyone who heard them. He said that some men believed power came from fear and violence, but fear could turn against its masters when pushed too far. The soldiers stared at him in confusion, while Turner shouted for someone to silence him. Yet before any guard could move closer, the giant did something no one expected. With one powerful motion, he pulled his arms apart. The iron chain between his wrists snapped with a loud metallic crack. The sound echoed through the yard like thunder. Shock swept across the crowd as the broken chain fell into the dirt. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers stood frozen. The overseers stared in disbelief, and the spectators felt a cold shiver pass through their bodies. The giant who had just survived a hanging stood free beneath the oak tree, his massive chest rising slowly with each breath. The broken rope swayed above him while dust drifted quietly through the air. In that moment, the crowd realized something they had not considered before. The execution they had come to watch had failed, and the man they had expected to see die was now standing stronger than ever. What happened next would turn fear into chaos and the quiet plantation into a place of screams, running feet, and unstoppable anger. Because the rope had snapped, but something else had been unleashed in its place. And before the sun set that day, the name count would become a legend whispered across the entire county. For several long seconds after the chain snapped, the entire clearing remained frozen in silence. Dust drifted slowly through the sunlight, while the broken links of iron lay scattered near Count's feet. The soldiers still held their rifles, yet none of them fired. Their eyes were locked on the giant standing beneath the oak tree. Moments earlier, they had expected to watch a man die. Now that same man stood before them, breathing slowly, calm and unbroken. The rope that had nearly killed him swung above his head, creaking softly against the branch. Around the clearing, the crowd began whispering nervously. Some stepped backward while others looked toward Caleb Turner, as if waiting for him to restore control. Turner's face had turned pale with fury. The humiliation of the broken rope burned inside him like fire. In front of dozens of witnesses, his authority had been challenged and shattered. He shouted sharply for the soldiers to shoot the giant where he stood. His voice cracked with anger as he demanded they end the spectacle immediately. But fear had already begun spreading among the men holding rifles. They had watched Count snap iron chains with his bare strength. They had seen the rope fail under his weight. Something about the moment felt unnatural to them. Still, a young soldier finally raised his rifle with shaking hands and aimed directly at Count's chest. The shot exploded through the clearing like thunder. Birds burst from the trees while the crowd flinched at the sound. The bullet struck Count in the shoulder. His body jerked slightly from the impact, but he did not fall. Instead, he took a slow step forward. Blood began to darken the torn fabric near his shoulder. Yet the giant's expression remained strangely calm. The soldier who fired the shot stared in horror as Count continued moving. Several more rifles lifted quickly, and another round of gunfire cracked through the air. The enslaved workers screamed and scattered, while the spectators stumbled backward in panic. Dust rose from the ground as bullets struck near Count's feet. One round tore across his arm. Another ripped through the side of his shirt. Yet the giant did not collapse the way the soldiers expected. Pain flashed across his face for a brief moment, but something stronger pushed him forward. With 2 heavy steps, he reached the nearest guard. The man tried to raise his rifle again, but it was too late. Count's massive hand closed around the wooden barrel and ripped the weapon away like a toy. The guard stumbled backward, terror spreading across his face as the giant hurled the rifle aside. Panic spread instantly through the clearing. Some soldiers ran for cover behind wagons, while others fired wildly without aiming. The spectators who had come for entertainment now fought each other to escape the yard. Women screamed while men pushed toward the open road in desperate fear. Through the chaos, Count moved like a storm breaking across the land. Each step carried the force of pure anger that had been buried for years. When another guard rushed toward him with a pistol raised high, the giant struck the man with a single swing of his arm. The guard crashed into the dirt and lay still. Several more soldiers tried surrounding him, but the sight of his towering figure, advancing through the smoke, shattered their courage. Josiah and the other enslaved workers watched from a distance with wide eyes. None of them had ever seen such a moment before. For generations, they had been forced to endure violence without resistance. Now the impossible was unfolding before them. One man stood against the power that had ruled their lives. Caleb Turner screamed orders from beside the oak tree. His voice was filled with rage and disbelief. He demanded the soldiers hold their ground and bring the giant down. Yet the fear spreading through the yard could not be stopped by shouting. Count turned slowly toward the plantation owner, his eyes burning with something far deeper than anger. Turner suddenly realized the giant was looking directly at him for the first time since the morning began. Real fear gripped his heart. He stepped backward while fumbling for the pistol hanging at his belt. Around him, several guards rushed forward to form a protective line. Gunfire cracked again as they tried to stop the advancing figure. Another bullet struck Count, this time tearing into his side. The impact forced him to stagger for a moment. Blood dripped onto the dry dirt beneath his feet. Yet even wounded, he continued moving forward with unstoppable determination. The soldiers fired again, but their hands trembled with panic. Their shots went wide or struck the ground near his legs. Within moments, the execution ground had turned into complete chaos. Wagons overturned as people tried to escape. Horses broke loose from their reins and galloped across the fields. Thick clouds of dust rose into the air, while gunfire echoed from every direction. In the middle of that storm of confusion stood the giant called Count, towering above everyone like a force of nature. When a guard charged toward him with a raised knife, the giant caught the man's arm and twisted it aside, before throwing him violently into the dirt. Another soldier attempted to strike him from behind with a rifle butt, but Count spun around and pushed the man away with such strength that he fell several yards back. The crowd watching from the road could barely believe what they were seeing. Many of them had come expecting a simple hanging. Instead, they were witnessing a battle unfolding in front of the old oak tree. Josiah felt tears filling his eyes as he watched the struggle. He knew the giant could not survive forever against guns and numbers. Yet something inside him stirred with pride and sorrow at the same time. For one brief moment, a man who had been condemned as property was standing as a free soul, refusing to bow to the power that tried to destroy him. Nearby, some of the enslaved workers began shouting in confusion and emotion. A few even stepped forward as if considering whether to join the fight, but the sound of another volley of gunfire forced them back again. 2 more bullets struck Count, one tearing across his leg and another grazing his back. The giant staggered heavily but refused to fall. He looked once more toward the terrified plantation owner standing behind his guards. Turner raised his pistol with shaking hands and fired directly at Count's chest. The shot struck hard. For the first time, the giant's strength faltered. He dropped to one knee beneath the oak tree, while the crowd gasped in shock. Soldiers rushed forward quickly, eager to finish the battle before he could rise again. Yet even then, Count lifted his head and looked out across the clearing. His eyes moved slowly toward the enslaved workers gathered near the cabins. Many of them stared back with tears streaming down their faces. In that moment, the giant spoke again, his deep voice carrying across the dusty yard. Despite the chaos around him, he told them that no chain lasted forever. He told them that fear could only rule as long as people believed it was stronger than their spirit. The soldiers shouted angrily for him to stay silent, but his words had already reached the hearts of those who listened. Several guards grabbed him from behind and forced him onto the ground, while another quickly wrapped a new rope around his neck. Caleb Turner approached slowly, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. He kicked the giant in the side and ordered the soldiers to hang him again immediately. This time they did not bother with speeches or crowds. They dragged Count toward the oak tree, while others held the rope tight above the branch. The giant struggled weakly as blood soaked the dirt beneath him. Yet his strength was fading after the many wounds he had suffered. With rough hands, the guards forced him onto another crate beneath the hanging rope. The clearing had grown strangely quiet again. Many spectators had already fled down the road, while others stood frozen in shock. The enslaved workers watched with broken hearts as the soldiers tightened the noose around Count's neck once more. Turner himself stepped forward and kicked the crate away with savage anger. This time the rope held. Count's massive body jerked beneath the branch as the noose pulled tight. The soldiers stepped back cautiously, while the giant struggled for several moments. His powerful legs kicked against the empty air before slowly growing still. The wind moved softly through the leaves above him, while the crowd watched in stunned silence. After a long time, the soldiers lowered his body to the ground and confirmed that life had finally left him. Yet the strange feeling that had filled the clearing earlier did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger. The crowd looked uneasily at the giant lying beneath the oak tree. Some whispered that the rope breaking the first time had been a sign. Others believed they had witnessed something that would not easily be forgotten. Caleb Turner ordered the body to remain hanging from the tree until sunset as a warning to everyone on the plantation. Then he turned and walked back toward his house without another word. The soldiers slowly dispersed while the remaining spectators hurried away down the road. But as evening approached and the sun began sinking behind the trees, strange rumors were already starting to spread among those who had witnessed the event. They spoke about the way the rope snapped the first time. They spoke about the giant standing calmly after being shot. And some even claimed that when the wind moved through the oak tree, they could hear a low creaking sound that almost resembled a deep voice whispering through the branches. By nightfall, the plantation had grown quiet again. Yet the story of what happened that day was only beginning, because the anger that had risen beneath that oak tree had not disappeared with Count's final breath. In the nights that followed, something would begin moving through the fields and forests surrounding Turner's land. Something that would make even the bravest men afraid to travel that road after dark. And the people who once gathered to watch the giant die would soon discover that some anger never truly leaves the earth. Night settled slowly over Caleb Turner's plantation on the evening after the hanging. The crowd that had filled the yard earlier in the day had long disappeared down the dusty road, carrying the story of the giant slave with them to nearby farms and towns. The oak tree now stood silent in the fading light, its thick branches stretching across the darkening sky. From one of those branches, the body of Count still hung as Turner had ordered, swaying slightly in the evening wind. The rope creaked softly against the bark, while shadows from the setting sun stretched across the empty yard. Most of the soldiers had already left, satisfied that the punishment had been carried out at last. Only a few guards remained behind to watch the plantation through the night. Yet despite the quiet, an uneasy feeling moved through the air like something alive. The enslaved workers had been forced back into their cabins before sunset. No fires were allowed outside that night. No talking, no gathering, no music. Turner wanted silence to cover the land like a blanket of fear. Inside the small wooden cabins, many people sat awake long after darkness arrived, whispering prayers or staring through the cracks in their doors toward the distant oak tree. Josiah sat on the edge of his bed with his hands folded together, his tired eyes filled with sorrow. He had watched many people die during his long life, but the image of Count standing beneath that broken rope would not leave his mind. The old man felt something restless moving inside his chest, something that told him the story of the giant was not finished. As the moon rose higher above the fields, the plantation slowly fell into a deep, uneasy quiet. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the distant sound of an owl echoed through the trees. One of the guards stationed near the oak tree shifted uncomfortably beside the wagon, where he sat with another soldier. They had drawn the unlucky duty of watching the body through the night. A small lantern hung from the wagon wheel, casting weak yellow light across the dirt ground. The rope still held Count high above them, his enormous shadow stretching across the grass whenever the wind moved the lantern flame. The younger guard tried to laugh about it, saying he had never seen a man so large, even in death, but his voice carried a nervous edge that betrayed his courage. His partner said nothing for a long time. Finally, he muttered that the rope breaking earlier in the day had not been natural. He had attended several hangings before, and never once had the rope snapped like that. The younger guard shrugged and said the giant had simply been too heavy. Yet even he kept glancing upward toward the dark shape, hanging above them. Hours passed slowly. The moon climbed higher while thin clouds drifted across the sky. Around midnight, the wind began to pick up slightly, rustling through the cotton fields and whispering through the branches of the old oak tree. The rope creaked again, louder this time, and the giant's body swayed gently from side to side. The guards watched the movement in silence. Then something strange happened. The lantern flame flickered wildly as a stronger gust of wind swept through the yard. For a brief moment, the clearing fell into near darkness. When the light steadied again, the younger guard leaned forward suddenly. He squinted toward the tree with confusion. Something looked different. He stood up slowly and walked closer to the oak tree, his boots crunching softly against the dry dirt. The other guard called out quietly, asking what he was doing. The young man did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared upward with growing unease. Then his voice came out low and uncertain. The rope was still hanging from the branch, but the body that had been tied to it was gone. For several seconds, neither man moved. The older guard jumped from the wagon and hurried toward the tree, lifting the lantern higher as he approached. The empty rope swung slowly above their heads. The knot had not been untied. The fibers looked torn apart, as if something powerful had ripped them open from inside. The lantern light shook in the guard's hand as he turned in a slow circle, searching the ground around the tree. There were marks in the dirt where the body had been lowered earlier in the evening. But now those marks continued across the yard in a long, uneven trail leading away from the tree toward the dark edge of the cotton fields. The younger guard whispered a frightened curse under his breath. He insisted someone must have stolen the body as a cruel joke. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they made little sense. No one on the plantation would risk such a thing under Turner's watch. The older guard stared toward the black rows of cotton, stretching into the distance. The wind moved through them with a soft whispering sound that seemed almost like distant voices. Back inside the cabins, several enslaved workers had also noticed something strange. Ruth, the same woman who once claimed to see Count standing beneath the moon weeks earlier, had been unable to sleep that night. She sat near the door of her cabin, listening to the restless wind outside. At some point, she heard a sound that made her heart beat faster. Heavy footsteps moved slowly through the yard between the cabins. They were not the quick steps of a guard. They were slow and powerful, each one pressing deeply into the earth. Ruth carefully pushed the door open a small distance and looked outside. Moonlight washed across the ground between the buildings. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, a massive shadow passed across the open space near the cabins. The figure moved silently, but its shape was unmistakable. Ruth felt her breath freeze in her throat. She could not clearly see the face, but the height, the shoulders, the long, powerful arms. They were impossible to mistake. The shadow walked past the cabins and disappeared into the cotton fields beyond. Ruth slammed the door shut and backed away in terror and disbelief. Not long after that, the alarm spread across the plantation. The guards near the oak tree ran toward the house, shouting that the body had vanished. Lanterns flared to life in every direction as soldiers and overseers rushed out to search the fields. Caleb Turner himself stormed into the yard, wearing only his night shirt and boots, furious that anyone would dare disturb the order he had fought to restore earlier that day. When the guards explained what they had discovered, his anger slowly turned into disbelief. He marched to the oak tree and grabbed the rope with his own hands. Examining the torn fibers, Turner shouted that someone had cut the rope to steal the body. But no knife marks could be found. The strands looked as if they had been pulled apart by immense force. The overseers searched the ground with lanterns and soon found the trail of deep footprints leading away through the cotton rows. The prints were enormous, far larger than any ordinary man's foot. Turner stared at them for a long moment without speaking. He ordered every available man to spread across the plantation and search the fields immediately. Lanterns moved through the dark rows of cotton like a line of glowing insects as the search began. The wind rustled the plants while men shouted each other's names in the darkness. Yet the deeper they moved into the fields, the quieter the night seemed to become. Several guards claimed they heard branches snapping in the distant woods beyond the plantation. Others thought they saw movement among the trees. But whenever they ran toward the sound, they found only darkness and empty ground. After nearly an hour of searching, one soldier came stumbling back toward the yard, pale and shaking. He said he had found something near the edge of the forest. The men followed him quickly to the spot where his lantern pointed toward the ground. There they discovered a broken rifle lying in the dirt. Its wooden stock snapped clean in half. The weapon belonged to one of the guards who had been stationed near the oak tree earlier that night. A few yards away, they found the guard himself lying unconscious beside the bushes, his face bruised and his breath shallow. When he finally woke moments later, he spoke only a few frightened words. He said something huge had stepped out of the darkness behind him. Something tall enough to block the moonlight. Before he could turn around completely, he felt a massive hand strike him, and everything went black. Those words spread through the group of men like ice water. Some of them glanced nervously toward the forest, where the tall trees swayed under the moon. Caleb Turner refused to show fear, but his jaw tightened as he listened. He shouted that the giant must still be alive somehow, and ordered the search to continue deeper into the woods. Yet inside his mind, a terrible thought had already begun forming. He remembered the moment the rope snapped earlier that day. He remembered the way Count had stood calmly even after being shot. And now the body had vanished from the very tree, meant to display his defeat. By the time the search party returned to the plantation house near dawn, none of them had found the missing giant. The woods beyond the fields remained silent and empty. But every man who had walked those dark rows carried the same uneasy feeling back with him. Something was moving out there in the darkness. And whatever it was, it had not finished its business with Caleb Turner, or the land that had tried to kill it. Dawn arrived slowly over the plantation, the morning after the body disappeared. But the light of the rising sun did nothing to calm the fear spreading across the land. The sky turned pale orange above the cotton fields, while a thick silence hung over the cabins and barns. No one had slept well that night. The guards who had searched the woods returned, with tired faces and shaking hands, whispering among themselves about the massive footprints and the broken rifle found in the forest. Caleb Turner stood on the porch of his large house, watching the fields as if expecting something terrible to rise from them at any moment. His pride refused to admit fear. Yet the uneasiness in his chest would not fade. The giant who had been hanged beneath the oak tree was supposed to be dead. The rope had held the second time. The soldiers had checked his body themselves. Yet the empty rope swinging in the wind told a different story. Turner told himself the explanation must be simple. Perhaps the giant had not died immediately. Perhaps someone had secretly cut him down during the night and carried him away. But deep inside, he knew none of those ideas explained the torn rope fibers or the enormous footprints in the dirt. He clenched his fists and shouted for the overseers to gather every man who could hold a weapon. Whatever was moving in the woods would be hunted down before the sun set again. Across the plantation, the enslaved workers slowly stepped out of their cabins under the watchful eyes of the guards. Word had already spread through whispered voices during the night. Everyone knew the body of Count had vanished. Some people looked frightened, while others carried an expression that had not appeared on their faces for many years. It was not joy exactly, but something close to hope. Ruth stood beside Josiah near the well, her hands trembling slightly as she described the shadow she had seen passing between the cabins. The old man listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if remembering something from long ago. Josiah had grown up hearing stories from elders who believed certain spirits could not be chained or broken by human cruelty. Those spirits waited patiently until the right moment to rise again. He did not know whether such stories were true, but when he looked toward the distant tree line at the edge of the fields, he felt a strange certainty that the land itself had changed during the night. By mid-morning, Turner had gathered a large search party made up of overseers, soldiers, and several armed men from nearby farms who had returned after hearing the strange news. Nearly 20 riders formed a line near the oak tree, while the rest prepared to follow on foot through the cotton fields. Turner stood before them with his pistol hanging at his side and anger burning in his eyes. He told them that the missing giant was nothing more than a dangerous fugitive who must be captured or killed immediately. He promised a reward to any man who found him first. Some of the men nodded eagerly, excited by the chance to prove their courage. Others shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, remembering the stories of how the rope had snapped and how the giant had stood after being shot. Yet none of them wanted to appear afraid in front of the others. With a final order from Turner, the search began again. The riders spread across the open fields, while the men on foot followed the deep tracks leading toward the forest. The footprints were easy to recognize. Each one pressed deeply into the dirt, larger than any normal boot mark and spaced far apart, as if made by someone taking powerful strides. The trail led straight into the dark trees, where the branches blocked much of the morning sunlight. Inside the forest, the air felt cooler and strangely still. Birds that normally filled the woods with noise seemed to have vanished. Even the horses grew restless as the riders guided them carefully between the trunks. One of the men joked nervously that the giant might be hiding behind a tree, waiting to grab someone. The laughter that followed sounded thin and forced. Everyone kept their weapons ready. For nearly an hour, the group followed the trail deeper into the woods. The footprints appeared clearly in the soft soil along the path, sometimes joined by dark drops of dried blood. The sight of that blood gave some of the men confidence. If the giant had truly survived the hanging, he must still be badly wounded. No man could lose that much blood and remain strong for long. Turner himself rode at the front of the group, staring down at the tracks with cold determination. He imagined the moment when they would finally corner the giant among the trees. The thought filled him with a mixture of anger and excitement. He wanted to see the man who had humiliated him in front of the entire county brought down like a wild animal. Then the trail suddenly ended. The riders stopped as the last clear footprint appeared in a patch of damp soil beside a fallen log. Beyond that spot, the ground remained untouched. The men looked around in confusion, searching for any sign that the giant had continued walking in another direction. Some dismounted and spread out to examine the surrounding area. But the result was always the same. The trail simply vanished. Turner cursed loudly and demanded they search more carefully. It made no sense for such large footprints to disappear in the middle of the forest. One of the soldiers suggested the giant might have climbed into the trees to hide. Several men glanced upward nervously at the branches swaying overhead, but the thick limbs showed no signs of disturbance. A sudden sound interrupted their search. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a heavy branch snapped sharply. The men turned quickly toward the noise with their rifles raised. The forest returned to silence again, as if nothing had happened. Then another sound followed, the faint thud of something large moving through the undergrowth. Turner ordered 2 of the soldiers to move forward and investigate. The men walked slowly between the trees, while the rest waited behind them. A moment later, a shout echoed through the woods. It was not a shout of discovery. It was a scream filled with pure terror. The group rushed toward the sound, just in time to see one of the soldiers thrown violently through a cluster of bushes. His body crashed against a tree and slid to the ground unconscious. The other soldier stumbled backward into the clearing with wide, terrified eyes. Before he could speak, a massive figure stepped out from the shadows behind him. The men froze in disbelief as the giant emerged into the pale sunlight filtering through the branches. Count stood there breathing heavily, his body covered in dried blood and torn cloth. Yet despite the wounds, he looked more alive than ever. His eyes burned with fierce determination as he faced the armed men surrounding him. For several seconds, no one moved. The forest felt smaller under the presence of the towering figure. Then one of the riders panicked and fired his rifle. The shot cracked loudly through the trees, and the battle began again. Bullets struck bark and leaves as the men fired wildly. Count lunged forward with sudden explosive strength, knocking one of the soldiers from his feet, before grabbing another by the arm and throwing him aside. The horses reared in panic, while the riders struggled to control them. Turner shouted for the men to hold their ground. But fear had already begun spreading through the group. The giant moved through them like a storm. Though wounded and bleeding, his strength remained terrifying. One guard swung a rifle at his head only to have it ripped from his hands and smashed against a tree. Another man tried to stab him with a knife, but was thrown backward into the dirt. Gunshots echoed again and again through the forest until smoke filled the air between the trees. At last, one bullet struck Count deep in the chest. The impact forced him to stagger heavily against a tree trunk. The forest fell quiet, except for the ragged breathing of the wounded giant. Caleb Turner stepped forward slowly with his pistol raised, his face twisted with hatred and fear. The other men stood behind him, watching nervously. Blood ran down Count's chest and soaked the ground at his feet. Yet his eyes remained fixed on Turner with the same calm strength that had unsettled everyone since the first day he arrived on the plantation. Turner lifted the pistol and aimed it directly at the giant's heart. The shot echoed through the trees. Count's body slid slowly down the trunk of the tree until he rested on the forest floor. For several moments, no one spoke. Then one of the men whispered that the giant was finally dead. But as the wind moved softly through the branches above them, a strange feeling passed through the group again. It was the same feeling many had experienced near the oak tree the day before. A feeling that the story of Count was still not truly finished. Because sometimes the anger of a man who has suffered too much does not die easily. And the land where that anger falls has a way of remembering. The forest remained silent for several long moments after the gunshot echoed through the trees. Smoke from Caleb Turner's pistol drifted slowly in the air while the men stared at the giant lying against the tree trunk. Count's enormous body was motionless now, his head slightly lowered, blood soaking into the soil beneath him. No one spoke at first. The riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, and the soldiers glanced at each other with nervous expressions. They had expected relief after the long, terrifying chase, but instead a strange heaviness filled the forest clearing. Turner stepped closer with cautious steps, still holding the pistol in his shaking hand. He stared down at the fallen giant for a long time, as if making certain that the threat had finally ended. The man who had broken chains, survived a snapping rope, and scattered armed soldiers now appeared quiet at last. One of the guards slowly approached and pressed his fingers against the giant's neck. After a moment, he nodded and whispered that the pulse was gone. A few of the men let out deep breaths as tension left their shoulders. The nightmare that had begun beneath the oak tree seemed finished. Yet none of them could explain why the forest still felt so uneasy, as if the ground itself had witnessed something too powerful to forget. Caleb Turner ordered the men to carry the body back to the plantation immediately. He wanted the giant buried far away from the oak tree and the cabins where the enslaved workers lived. Several men hesitated before lifting the body because of its enormous weight. It took 6 of them to raise Count onto a wagon brought through the forest trail. Even in death, his size made him look almost unreal among the ordinary men surrounding him. The wagon creaked loudly as it rolled back through the woods toward the plantation road. No one spoke during the journey. Each man seemed lost in his own thoughts, remembering the moment the rope had snapped and the giant had risen again before the entire crowd. By the time they reached the plantation yard, the sun had already begun sinking toward the western hills. The sky burned orange above the cotton fields, casting long shadows across the ground. The enslaved workers stood quietly near their cabins, watching the wagon arrive. Word had spread quickly that the giant had been found in the forest. When they saw the lifeless body lying across the wooden boards, many lowered their heads in silence. Josiah stood among them with tears shining in his old eyes. He knew that what Count had done during those last hours would remain in the hearts of the people for generations. Turner refused to hold any ceremony. He ordered the men to dig a deep grave near the edge of the forest, where the soil was hard and dry. The hole was finished just as darkness began spreading across the land. Lanterns flickered around the pit, while the giant's body was lowered into the earth. For a moment, the wind moved through the nearby trees with a low whispering sound that made several men glance nervously toward the shadows. Turner ignored the feeling and signaled for the grave to be covered quickly. Shovels scraped against the dirt until the pit was filled and flattened. No stone marked the spot. No sign remained to show where the giant had been laid to rest. Turner believed that once the body disappeared beneath the ground, the memory of the man would fade as well. But history rarely works that way. As the last shovel of dirt settled, the wind moved again through the trees, stronger this time, bending the branches toward the dark sky. Some of the men standing there later swore they heard a faint, deep sound carried in that wind. It almost resembled a voice rising from the earth itself. Life on the plantation returned to its usual routine in the days that followed, at least on the surface. The cotton fields filled again with workers bending beneath the sun. Overseers shouted their orders, and the wagons rolled along the dusty roads as they always had. Yet something inside the people had quietly changed. The story of the giant who stood against the rope traveled quickly beyond the plantation. Farmers, travelers, and traders repeated the tale in markets and taverns across the county. They spoke about the moment the rope snapped beneath the oak tree and the giant rose again before a crowd of witnesses. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was pure strength and courage, refusing to die quietly. No matter how the story was told, the name count began spreading from mouth to mouth like a legend, growing stronger with every retelling. Even the enslaved workers carried the story in their hearts. At night, when the overseers were far away, whispers moved between the cabins about the man who stood tall when everyone else had been forced to bow. Josiah often walked quietly to the far edge of the fields where the forest began. He would stand there looking toward the trees where the final battle had taken place. The old man knew that death had taken the giant's body, but he also understood something deeper. Some actions echo through time long after the person is gone. Count had shown the people something they had nearly forgotten. He had shown them that fear could be challenged. That even in chains, a person could still stand with dignity. The old man believed that one day the story would inspire others who longed for freedom. It might not happen immediately. It might take years or even generations. But the memory of the giant would not disappear as Turner had hoped. It would travel quietly from voice to voice, from parent to child, from one hidden gathering to another. Meanwhile, Caleb Turner tried to bury the memory as deeply as the grave in the forest. He forbade anyone on the plantation from speaking the giant's name. The oak tree where the hanging had taken place was cut down and burned, leaving only a black scar in the dirt. Yet even that did not erase the whispers. Travelers passing the road nearby began telling strange stories about the land. Some claimed that on certain nights, when the wind moved across the cotton fields, a deep creaking sound echoed through the darkness like a rope pulling against a branch. Others said they saw an enormous shadow standing near the tree line before fading into the forest. Whether those stories were real or imagined, they added another layer to the legend that had already begun growing. Years later, the plantation itself changed as time moved forward. New owners came and went. The fields were divided, and the old house slowly fell into ruin. But the story remained alive in the memories of the people who lived nearby. Parents told their children about the giant who refused to bow to cruelty. Travelers shared the tale with strangers beside evening fires. The place where the oak tree once stood became known by a simple name among locals: the ground of the broken rope. And deep in the forest, somewhere beneath layers of earth and roots, the body of Count rested in silence while his story continued to move through history like a powerful echo. Because some men leave behind more than bones when they die. They leave behind courage, anger, and truth that refuse to disappear. And that is why we still tell stories like this today. Thank you for spending this time with us here. If this story moved you, or made you think about the past in a new way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching. It is always incredible to see how these powerful stories travel across the world. And remember, history is not just about dates and places. It is about people, courage, and the voices that refuse to be forgotten.